We start right away into a new podcast with a very special guest today. Traveled from the United States to Europe, from New York City to Brussels. It's David Harris, president of the American Jewish Committee. David, thank you for coming and thank you for being so kind to be with me in this podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Lucas. It's actually my pleasure.
Just as a warm-up question for our listeners, David, what exactly is the American Jewish Committee?
Well, the easiest way for your listeners to learn would be to go to our website, ajc.org. But in a sentence, we were founded in 1906 as the first American Jewish organization to focus on the security and safety and well-being of Jews, not just in the United States, but around the world. And for the last now 114 years, we've been doing exactly that, with a headquarters in New York, offices across the United States, now 8 posts in Europe, and offices as well in Latin America and in Asia, and of course in Israel.
Thank you for this recommendation. Also to visit the website for more information. I know the American Jewish Committee from the cooperation on a daily basis, and I really, really appreciate the work you are doing, and that's why I also appreciate very much that you are visiting. But I also do appreciate that due to your personal story, and that's the thing I want to start with this talk in this podcast. Your father was Austrian, and it's an honor for Austria that we can say today, you're an Austrian today, and you have been an Austrian now for 2 months. You're a pretty new Austrian citizen, as well as an American citizen. And the honor is on Austria's side because your father, as a Jew, was treated bad by Austrians during the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, the Shoah, and before that. But it would be better if you share something about your personal story and your family story in order that we come into the position to understand better what a huge friendship it is today from your side to accept the Austrian citizenship. How did this all come about?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Actually, I need to correct one thing. My father was not an Austrian, and that actually explains why I became an Austrian. My father, Eric, was born in 1920 in Budapest. He made his way to Vienna and lived in Vienna for a number of years until the Anschluss. When he was 16 years old in 1936, apparently he was a bit of a scientific wunderkind, and he entered the Institute of Chemistry in Vienna. 2 years later, in 1938, after the Anschluss, he was expelled. But he lived in Austria all those years as a Hungarian, not as an Austrian, and he could not get Austrian citizenship. In 1938, after he was expelled from the Institute of Chemistry, like many Jews, he was forced to shine the shoes of Nazi officers and do other degrading things until he was able to leave Austria and arrived in Paris. And that began for him a very long war story, which only ended in 1945 when he worked with the OSS, which was the American Espionage Services, the predecessor to the CIA. And part of his work, he told me before he died, was actually behind enemy lines in Austria again. The OSS brought him to the United States in order to help create the CIA. That's how he arrived in the United States. My mother was born in Moscow during the Stalinist period, and with her family was among the last Jews to be able to leave Soviet Russia. They moved to Paris, again, like both Romanovs and Jews, and lived in Paris until 1940 when the Nazis occupied France. And again, like many Jews and non-Jews as well, they went south. In France, spent 17 months in hiding, fleeing until they were able to cross the border to Spain and then to Portugal and eventually came to the United States. But the real reason that I became an Austrian citizen is because my father did not. And I'll be even more, if I may, honest. My father disliked and detested Austria till the day he died.
And there is a very tragic part, not only regarding the death, which is tragic itself, but also the reaction of Austrian authorities,
Right.
of your father contacting these authorities after being convinced by,
By me.
his children, by you,
By me.
as far
By
as I
me.
know. What's this story about?
So my father felt before he died that he was betrayed by Austria 3 separate times. In that period, just after the Anschluss, during the war itself, of course, and then after the war, when he felt that Austria hid behind the Moscow Declaration of 1943, that Austria was somehow the first victim nation of the Nazis rather than a complicit nation. So 3 separate times, pre-war, war, and post-war. So his feelings about Austria were extremely, extremely negative. Now, fast forward to the 1990s, Austria establishes a national fund. After Franz Wernicke began the process of confronting Austrian history in a very serious way. And my father was getting old, he was retired, money was an issue, and I convinced him to apply to the Austrian National Fund. He did not want to. He said, it's blood money, and I will not let Austria buy me with a check, buy my conscience with a check. And finally I convinced him, no, Dad, do this, please. Better that you have the money, that Austrian National Fund has the money. And he went through all the papers and he filed all the documents and he was complaining the whole time about this. And then finally it was submitted, and months later the letter came and they said he was rejected. And shortly afterwards he died. So he died reinforced in his anger and bitterness towards Austria. Some months after his death, I was contacted as his son by the Austrian National Fund, and I was told, we made a mistake. Your father should have received the money. Where is he? We're looking for him. We'd like to send whatever the amount is. And I had to tell them, I'm sorry, my father is dead. And he died even more bitter. So that was the story. I had never thought about getting Austrian citizenship then because my father I think, would have turned over in his grave. But 20 years passed, and I watched Austria very, very carefully. I traveled to Austria more. By the way, I myself lived in Vienna for some months, which is another story that perhaps your listeners would be interested in. And finally, I must say that between the period of Franz Wernicke's start and then Sebastian Kurz's leadership, in that period of time, I became convinced that Austria had changed. And I thought, I don't need Austrian citizenship simply as a toy or as a second passport. I wanted to finish the journey that my father could not finish in 1938. He was denied Austrian citizenship. And so just over 80 years later, I received Austrian citizenship.
After this tragic story, everyone can understand what it means that you accept the citizenship of Austria. And of course, I have to confirm that Franz Wernicke, as a social democrat, while I'm a member of the People's Party, really contributed a lot to a way Austria began in the end of the 80s or in the beginning of the 90s. And before going deeper into today's position of Austria regarding the connection with Israel, regarding defending Jewish life in Austria and beyond the Austrian borders all over Europe, and maybe also contributing to protecting Jewish life all over the world, I of course want to ask you on your month you spent in Vienna. As you have mentioned, it would be of course interesting. So for what purpose did you live in Vienna?
So I'm not sure that many of your listeners know this, but it's an important part of post-war Austrian history. Austria became the first arrival point for many refugees fleeing communism. So the Hungarians in 1956, the Czechs in 1968, and beginning in the early 1970s, Jews coming from the Soviet Union and sometimes other East European countries. I arrived in Vienna with my future wife in 1978. The office was on Brahmsplatz, not far from the Diplomatic Academy, and my wife and I found a flat in the 17th Bezirk. And again, I came to Austria very honestly with this weight that my father's history had put on me. So initially, I kind of resisted Austria. We did our work, and we were young people, so we played when we could. But I was slowly drawn into the fact that Jews by the thousands were arriving in Vienna, and Austria was welcoming them and hosting them and protecting them from Palestinian and other terrorists. And over the many months we lived in Austria, I came to see a different Austria as well. And I then had to live with this sort of duality, my father's Austria and the Austria that I began to see with this migration through Vienna of so many Jews. And that began the process of changing my mind. Franz Wernicke accelerated it. Sebastian Kurz, if you will, cemented it. And that's why today, proudly, I have an Austrian passport. And I'm proud to say that I've closed a circle that began over 80 years ago in my own family.
Thank you. That means a lot to an Austrian. Mentioning Sebastian Kurz leads to Austria's today's position. Also in the new government led by Sebastian Kurz. And in the government's program, it's clearly mentioned that Austria will not support any resolution on the United Nations level doubting the right of Israel to exist or putting double standards regarding Israel on the table and things like that. So I try to follow this path led by Sebastian Kurz in Austria on a parliamentary level in European Parliament. But what's your overall assessment on Austria's today's position in this crucial question, which has been a crucial question, maybe not only for decades, but for centuries, and is becoming even more crucial in our time since anti-Semitism is rising. And as we all know, European Union, the Parliament, the Council, as well as the Commission, has decided on a definition of anti-Semitism, which means that the old awful European anti-Semitism with a strong connection to Austria, as we have to confess, is one kind of anti-Semitism. The other one in Europe present is the one that comes along with migration. And the third one is doubting the right of Israel to exist or using double standards against the state of Israel or doubting that it would be a democracy or a rule of law-based state. So all these kinds of anti-Semitism we have to fight. And maybe I can add one last point before you speak. A good Jewish friend many years ago told me the story that when he was in Austria, a student's representative, there was formed a working group against anti-Semitism. And in his group, he was the only Jew. Everybody thought it was self-understanding that it's clear that he should take care of this working group against anti-Semitism. And what my friend that time, as he told me, said was, anti-Semitism is not my problem, it's your problem. And that's actually true. That's so true. And that's something we have to think about and to follow with our action we take. Anyway, you're, as a president, in charge of the American Jewish Committee, and you're doing a lot, as you have mentioned, beyond the borders of America or the Americas. You're doing a lot of, let's say, civil society-based diplomatic work, and you have a deep insight into this question, which leads me to this short question. What's your overall assessment to Austria's position today?
So, having been involved in Jewish diplomacy now for 4 decades, I can say that for much of that time, Austria was, if I may say so, not really a significant factor. It was a relatively quiet, understated if you will, almost neutral country when it came to the issues you're discussing, Lucas. And so we, as a consequence, at the American Jewish Committee, did not devote a great deal of our own time to trying to change the mind of Austria or engage in conversation with Austria because, as they say, the return on investment was minimal. But that changed in recent years. Austria has become a very significant factor. And I think for me, one of the personal highlights of my career was in June of 2018 when we hosted the American Jewish Committee Global Forum, which is our big annual conference, for the first time ever outside the United States. And we did it in Israel on the 70th anniversary year of Israel's rebirth. And we invited Chancellor Sebastian Kurz as a special guest. And I can tell you from the inside that many people in that audience, and the audience was probably 2,500 people at the convention center in Jerusalem. Many people, because they told me beforehand, were skeptical. Why did you invite the Austrian chancellor? Why Austria? What has Austria actually done compared to other countries that have a much more robust relationship? And I said, I've had the privilege of meeting with Sebastian Kurz, first as foreign minister and now as chancellor. Give him a chance. Listen to him speak. Listen to him. He gave an amazing speech. An amazing speech. And in the middle of that speech, he said something historic. For the first time in Austria's post-war history, he said that our commitment to Israel, its security, its safety, is now going to be based on the principle of Staatsräson, raison d'être, national interest of Austria. That was a complete conceptual breakthrough. It had never been said before. When he finished the speech, you had to see the reaction of the audience. The skeptics, the cynics, standing up as one, a warm, sustained, standing ovation for the Chancellor of Austria. He's changed Austrian policy. He's changed it bilaterally. He's changed it multilaterally. He's changed it here in Brussels. He's changed it at the United Nations. We feel it, we see it, and we greatly appreciate it.
Good to hear that. And first of all, as an Austrian citizen, I'm more than happy to live in times when Austria is that clear on this important question. And also as an elected official, I'm more than happy to be able to do my work under this paradigm Sebastian Kurz has opened now, and I hope and I'm sure it will continue, and it will mean a lot for both sides mutually, for Israel and Austria, but also for the rest of the world by the example of our relation in the field of security and safety, of course, but also in other fields, in economy, in tourism even. The Israeli embassy in Austria is extremely active in promoting tourism between Israel and Austria. And there are many, many fields where we can strengthen our friendship, I guess, Austria and Israel. Since we are taping this podcast in the premises of a parliament, of the European Parliament, I would like to go deeper into the question what parliamentarism and especially what I would call parliamentary diplomacy means to all our causes, but because, of course, you are mainly dealing with the executive branch, with prime ministers, heads of governments, and so on. But there's also the legislative branch, and there is something like parliamentary diplomacy. So in what way, in your view and due to your experience, can parliamentary diplomacy contribute to our common causes?
Well, because of my parents' journeys, I actually grew up as an American. So my parliamentary model is the United States Congress. That was my reference point growing up. And in the United States, the U.S. Congress plays a very significant role in foreign policy. So for me, that's how I learned what the parliamentary role is and can be. When the Transatlantic Friends of Israel was established by with the support of you, Lucas, and other members of the European Parliament, And with the encouragement of our friends, our AJC friends here in Europe, we look very much to the, if you will, the American model as a starting point for parliamentary activism. The European Parliament has increasingly become important in European decision making. Earlier in its life, it wasn't seen as quite as consequential, but now it's seen as very consequential. And in Israel, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has always been active on everything. So the thought was, why not try and connect those who are interested in relations with Israel in Washington, in Brussels, with those in Israel who are counterpart parliamentarians, and see how we can enhance the discussion and dialogue. That doesn't mean that everyone has to agree on every issue. It does mean that we affirm the importance of the relationships among the United States, Europe, and Israel as solid, robust democracies who have a lot to share with each other, a lot in common, and parliamentarians should be speaking to each other, by the way, across party lines. I think one of the most gratifying things for me, going back to Austria for one moment, was the new coalition agreement that brought the current government into power, and that it was forged with the Green Party, and that the Green Party, as part of the agreement between the parties to form the government, accepted all the things that you mentioned earlier in this conversation, Lucas. It means that this is not just about one party. It means that it's now increasingly seen as in Austria's national interest, not just the interests of a particular individual or a particular party, but in Austria's national interest to deepen its connection to the one and only Jewish majority nation on earth, Israel, and such an important partner for Austria and, I dare say, for Europe.
We have not yet mentioned in this podcast that Israel is the only democracy and the only rule of law based state in the whole Middle East, and this is one more reason why the connection is so important also for our security. I really appreciate your positive view on parliamentarism, and I thank you for this good cooperation all over the world. As I always put it, I think parliamentarism is one of the greatest innovations of mankind. Some would assume printing books would be a great innovation, or electricity. Well, that might be true, but
we can allow for 2 or 3 great achievements of mankind.
Beautiful, and maybe parliamentarism is also among them. Since it means to talk and to decide without violence, and to have, as the famous philosopher Sir Karl Popper once mentioned, to have elections from time to time. So nothing is in place forever in a democracy, in a parliamentary system, but the representatives have to be re-elected or get replaced. And as I say sometimes to school students groups and others visiting the European Parliament, state responsibilities, the executive branch represent states, but the parliamentary branch, the legislative branch, represent people. And this leads me to my next question. I remember when we first met in New York City, and I really was glad that you had me, because you couldn't see it, one couldn't see it, but you were tired. You must have been tired since you came from Vienna, actually, from my hometown, with, of course, jet lag. But we had a great talk for nearly 2 hours, and I will always remember that. And I remember something that's always important, and that you also mentioned there, that remembering the victims of the Holocaust, the Shoah, alone isn't the right thing. Right would it be if you also work, and we in Europe, officials as well as civil society and everybody, also work on establishing proper conditions for safe Jewish life in Europe and all over the world. So maybe you can give us a deeper insight into this question, since I also experience in talks with other elected officials that when you start bringing on the agenda that proper, safe Jewish life should be and must be possible in Europe and all over the world, they immediately talk about, in their reflection on that, immediately talk about remembrance. So like this would be the same, or like remembrance would be it, and all the other things are not that important. But maybe it's the other way around. So what can we do, and what's our obligation from your point of view to really establish a sustainable opportunity to live properly and safe for Jews in Europe?
So several years ago, I was honored to be invited to be one of the speakers at Mauthausen for a major commemoration. There were 3 presidents of countries. There was the chairman of the Russian parliament. There was a representative from Israel, and there was myself. I was the 5th of the 6 speakers, the 3 presidents, and then the chairman of the Russian parliament. I listened carefully to each of the speeches, and they focused on remembrance. They were moving, they were touching, but in my judgment, they were missing something fundamental. So I, in a way, got rid of my planned remarks, and in front of the 1,000 or more invited guests, I spoke spontaneously. And what I said then, and what I continue to believe, Lucas, is that it's important, obviously, to remember, to honor the memory. If you don't honor the memory, in a way, you've killed the people a second time. But if you're serious about the lessons learned, it cannot only be about dead Jews. No matter how much we remember at Mauthausen and Auschwitz and Birkenau and Buchenwald and Babi Yar, we will not bring back 6 million murdered Jews. The real test of remembrance, I believe, is how we deal in this case with living Jews. And in that respect, I also said, and living Jews means living Jews around the world, and living Jews means the one and only Jewish majority nation, Israel. One cannot cry tears on January 27th at memorial sites, and on January 28th, either ignore living Jews and the resurgence of anti-Semitism, or witness the demonization and vilification of Israel as a Jewish state, and then authentically commemorate the lessons of the Shoah. And that was my message then, and it's been my message since, including last night at a commemorative event here in Brussels. I also believe that remembrance is not only or exclusively for Jews and about Jews. One of the central lessons, I believe, of the 20th century is how slippery the slope was from democracy to totalitarianism. How a country, Germany, that was viewed as among the most advanced and educated countries on the planet could descend so quickly to January 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, and all the events that unfolded thereafter, and in 1938 to the Anschluss in Austria's collaboration, and on and on and on. All our young people, Jewish and non-Jewish, in every democratic society, has to understand that democracy is not something to be taken for granted. It's something that must be defended. And I say it especially now in 2020. Why? Because for many, liberal democracy is under assault. People are now questioning whether liberal democracy is the solution for us, for our countries, for our societies. And unless people know something about history, they may be too willing to follow the next populist voice of whatever, far left, far right. My family was victim of both Hitler and Stalin, so I know what extremes look like. And we have to be certain that we're on guard 24/7, not just for Jews and as Jews, but as citizens of democratic societies, that we've learned the lessons of the 20th century.
Thank you, David. I guess that's really an important and convincing final remark. And thank you for our good cooperation. Thank you for everything you are, I have to say, doing good for the world. And I hope a lot of people will join in their individual lives, in their capacities, whatever it would be, in a positive way. Thank you for joining this podcast, for the deep insights you also gave to your personal life and to your family's history, and also to the big issues that are important for the whole world. Thank you.
So, Lucas, I can say now authentically from one Austrian citizen to another, it was my pleasure.